The following days passed in a blur of celebrations and final agreements. The trade treaty was officially signed, marking a historic moment for both Earth and the Xaverian Empire. Xaverian technology would soon be shared with humanity, opening up possibilities that had once seemed impossible. But despite the diplomatic victory, James couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more important left unresolved. He had spent weeks negotiating, learning about Xaverian customs, and even enduring the trial of honor. Yet through all of it, one thing had become clearer than any treaty or agreement: his growing feelings for Princess Leia. It had started with small, almost imperceptible moments: the way her eyes softened when she looked at him, the way she always took a few extra seconds to speak with him after each meeting. He had tried to push those thoughts aside, focusing on the job at hand. But now, with everything settled and the negotiations concluded, he could no longer ignore the truth. James found himself walking toward the royal gardens once again, where he knew Leia often took a moment to herself. The palace was quieter than usual, as many of the officials had already left for their respective duties. The scent of the glowing flowers filled the air, mixing with the soft hum of the trees that seemed to whisper in the breeze. When he reached the garden, he spotted her standing by the edge of the peaceful pond, her back to him. Her silver hair was braided neatly down her back, and her posture was as regal as always. But there was something different in her expression, an air of reflection, as if she were wrestling with something deep inside. James approached carefully, not wanting to disturb her, but also feeling like he couldn't leave without saying what had been on his mind for days. "Princess Leia," he called softly. She turned, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of warmth and uncertainty. "James," she said, her voice quiet, "I thought you had already left with the others." He shook his head. "I couldn't leave without speaking to you one last time." Leia's brow furrowed slightly, but she didn't say anything. She simply waited, as though she knew there was something important coming. James stepped closer, feeling his heart race. He wasn't sure how to say what he needed to say, but he knew he couldn't keep it inside any longer. "Leia," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "I came here to complete a mission, to make history for our people. And I did. But what I didn't expect was to meet you. And now, I can't imagine leaving without knowing where we stand." Leia took a deep breath, her silver eyes searching his. "James, you know my duty is to my people. My role as princess cannot be forgotten, no matter what I feel. I cannot simply follow my heart. There are too many responsibilities." James nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "I understand that, but I don't want to leave with any regrets. If you feel the same way, if there's any chance." Leia's lips parted as if she were about to say something, but then she paused, looking out at the pond. She seemed to be weighing her words carefully. Finally, she met his gaze once more. "James," she said softly, "I have struggled with this for days. My heart tells me one thing, but my duty tells me another. But perhaps, just perhaps, there is room for both." A spark of hope lit inside him as he took a step closer. "Then let's find that room together." Leia smiled, the faintest hint of warmth spreading across her face. For the first time, she seemed to let go of the rigid walls she had built around herself. "Perhaps we can," she whispered. In that moment, it felt like everything had come full circle. James had come to Xiverus to negotiate a treaty, but what he had gained was something far more meaningful, a connection with someone who had once seemed so distant, yet was now within reach. As they stood together in the garden, the future felt uncertain. But for the first time, it also felt possible. James Carter, a human diplomat, stepped off the shuttle and onto the grand landing platform of the Xaverian Palace. It was a massive structure, glowing with silver and deep blue hues, floating high above the capital city of Xiverus Prime. The air was thick with an unfamiliar but pleasant fragrance, and the palace guards, tall, armored aliens with sharp golden eyes, stood motionless as they observed the human guest. James had been sent by Earth's diplomatic council to establish a trade agreement with the Xaverians, a powerful and secretive alien empire. Very few humans had ever set foot inside their royal palace, making this mission an important one. If successful, it would open doors for humanity to access Xaverian technology, something Earth desperately needed. A female attendant, dressed in flowing white and gold robes, approached him. Her deep violet skin shimmered under the palace lights, and she gestured for James to follow. "You will wait in the royal chambers until the princess is ready to see you," she said in a melodic voice. James nodded, adjusting his diplomatic badge, and followed her through the long corridors of the palace. He admired the strange alien architecture, curved walls with glowing symbols, floating lanterns that moved on their own, and crystal-clear floors that showed the palace gardens far below. Everything was breathtaking. The attendant finally stopped in front of a large door. "This is your assigned chamber. Please wait inside. The princess will summon you when she is ready." James stepped in as the door slid shut behind him. The room was luxurious, filled with soft cushions, exotic plants, and a pool of warm. James sat on the cold stone floor of his temporary holding chamber, staring at the glowing blue symbols carved into the walls. The room wasn't exactly a prison, but it felt like one. A single Xaverian guard stood outside the door, watching him with an expressionless face. The trial of honor. He had no idea what it involved, but from the serious expressions of the council, it was clear this was not a simple test. Just then, the door slid open, and Princess Lyraya stepped inside. She was dressed in a deep blue robe, her silver eyes unreadable as she studied him. James stood up quickly, unsure of what to say. "Princess Lyraya." She nodded. "I came to speak with you before the trial." James crossed his arms. "You could have just let me go, you know." Lyraya's lips pressed together. "I cannot. Our people have strict laws. If I made an exception for you, it would bring dishonor to my name." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "And this trial? What exactly am I supposed to do?" Lyraya hesitated. "It is a test of self-control and trust. Xaverians value discipline above all else. A warrior who flinches in fear is a weak one." James raised an eyebrow. "So I have to prove I'm not afraid." Lyraya gave a small nod. "In a way, you will stand in the center of the arena while the Xaverian warrior tests you. You must not react, no matter what happens." James frowned. "That's it." Lyraya's gaze darkened. "That is it." James didn't like the way she said it. He sighed and sat back down. "You know, humans and Xaverians are really different." Lyraya tilted her head. "How so?" James shrugged. "For example, back on Earth, privacy is important, but not in the way it is for you. Humans don't treat it as a sacred thing like your people do. And modesty. We get embarrassed when someone sees us unclothed." He gave her a pointed look. "Unlike Xaverians, apparently." Lyraya's silver eyes narrowed slightly. "You were the one who reacted so strongly." James laughed dryly. "Yeah, well, in human culture, walking in on someone like that is humiliating." Lyraya's expression softened just a little. "That is interesting." She seemed to consider something before speaking again. "Perhaps our differences are what make this situation so complicated." James sighed. "Yeah, no kidding." There was a pause before Lyraya said, "I believe you did not mean to offend me, James Carter. That is why I gave you the trial instead of punishment." James looked up at her, surprised. There was something genuine in her voice. She turned to leave but stopped at the door. "You should rest. The trial will not be easy." As she left, James exhaled. He had just one chance to prove himself, and failure was not an option. The days following their quiet conversation in the garden were filled with a new sense of understanding between James and Lyraya. The weight of duty and responsibility still loomed over her, but for the first time, she allowed herself to consider a future that wasn't solely defined by her position as princess. For James, the realization that his feelings for her were returned made the moments they shared feel more precious, more real. However, even as their connection deepened, the inevitable question remained: what came next? James had come to Zivaris on a diplomatic mission. He was supposed to return to Earth soon, to report the success of the treaty and continue the work of strengthening human-alien relations. But now, the idea of leaving Lyraya behind felt impossible. He had spent so much time thinking about the future of their two worlds that he had never fully considered the future of his own heart. One evening, after a long day of meetings, James found himself once again standing in the royal gardens. The stars twinkled brightly above, casting a soft glow over the surroundings. It was here, in this peaceful space, that he had first found clarity. Lyraya was already there, standing near the edge of the pond. The gentle ripple of the water mirrored the calm that had settled between them. She turned as she heard his footsteps, her silver eyes meeting his with a soft, knowing look. "James," she said, her voice low but steady, "I have spent so many days trying to balance my duty and my heart. You are not from here. You are from a world so far away, a world I may never truly understand." James stepped forward, his heart heavy with the weight of what he was about to say. But he knew it had to be said. "I understand more than you think. I came here as a diplomat, as a human trying to do my job. But somewhere along the way, I realized it wasn't just about the treaty anymore. It was about you. It was about us." Lyraya's expression softened, and she stepped closer. "I don't know what the future holds for either of us. There are too many challenges, too many expectations, but I cannot ignore what I feel." James reached out, gently taking her hand in his. "Then let's face those challenges together. I don't want to leave Zivaris without knowing that we gave this a chance. No matter how hard it may be, no matter the distance between our worlds, I'm willing to try. Are you?" The silence stretched for a moment before Lyraya smiled, a small but genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I am willing to try, James. For the first time, I'm willing to choose something that comes from my heart, not just my duty." As the words hung in the air between them, something shifted. The weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a shared hope for something new, something real. James looked at her, his heart swelling with emotions he hadn't allowed himself to fully acknowledge until now. "Then we'll make our own future, Lyraya. Together." Lyraya's eyes shimmered as she stepped closer, and for the first time, their worlds seemed to overlap. The human and the Zivarian, standing side by side, united in their decision. The future was still uncertain, and the road ahead would not be easy. But with each other, they felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they would build something stronger than any treaty, something that only love and trust could create. As they stood there, hand in hand, looking out over the royal gardens, they both knew one thing for certain. They had just started a new chapter in their lives, one where their hearts would guide them, no matter the distance between their worlds. The days following their quiet conversation in the garden felt different. James couldn't quite put his finger on it, but something had changed between him and Princess Lyraya. Their interactions had grown less formal, more comfortable. They shared more smiles, more moments of genuine understanding, and less of the rigid diplomatic distance that had separated them when they first met. The negotiations had progressed smoothly since his trial, with the terms of the trade agreement almost finalized. Zivarian technology would soon be shared with Earth, and that was all that mattered. But as the final day of talks drew near, James couldn't help but feel like there was something he hadn't fully understood yet, something about Lyraya, something he didn't want to ignore. On the morning of the last meeting, as James walked toward the council chambers, he was approached by an unexpected figure, Commander Saller, the same warrior who had tested him during the trial of honor. Zaller's golden eyes studied him for a moment, and then he spoke. "Human, I must say, I did not expect you to last this long." James raised an eyebrow. "Glad to know I'm full of surprises." Sailor smiled slightly, though his expression remained mostly serious. "You are more than just a diplomat. The princess has seen something in you." James blinked. "What do you mean?" Zalor's voice lowered. "She is not one to share her emotions easily, but I have seen the way she looks at you." James's heart skipped a beat, and he suddenly felt the weight of the conversation. "What are you getting at, Zalor?" The Zyverian commander paused, then spoke with a deep, almost knowing tone. "There is respect between you two, yes. But I can see it. It's more than respect. She is torn." James felt a mixture of confusion and curiosity. "Torn?" Zalor nodded, his eyes narrowing slightly. "She is a princess. She has her duties, her people, her responsibilities. But I can see the way she looks at you, and I can tell that she is thinking of something beyond duty." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, James didn't know how to respond. He had felt the shift in their relationship too. Those subtle moments, the unspoken attraction that had grown between them. But he had never considered that Luraya might be facing a struggle of her own. "She is not like us," Zalor continued, his voice quieter now. "Zyverians are bound by tradition, by honor, but sometimes even the strongest warrior cannot fight what the heart desires." James stared at him for a long moment, his mind racing. Was Zalor implying what he thought he was? Before he could ask anything else, the commander turned to leave. "Think carefully, human. There is more at stake here than just a treaty." James stood there for a moment, his thoughts swirling. He had come to Zyveris on a mission to negotiate peace, but it seemed that the journey he had embarked on was now leading him down a much more personal path. That evening, after the last negotiations had concluded, James found himself standing once again in the palace gardens. This time, Princess Luraya wasn't alone. She was standing by the same glowing flowers where they had spoken days ago. When she saw him, her eyes softened, just a little, and she walked toward him. The conversation that followed wasn't about trade agreements or politics. It was about something deeper, something neither of them had spoken aloud until now. "James," Luraya began, her voice quieter than usual. "The treaty is complete. The council is pleased, and I have done my duty." James nodded, but there was a weight in his chest. He took a step closer. "And what about you? What do you want?" Luraya looked at him for a long moment, her expression conflicted. Finally, she took a deep breath. "I want more than just duty, James, but I cannot simply follow my heart." James's voice was steady but gentle. "You don't have to follow anything but what feels right." Luraya met his gaze, her eyes filled with uncertainty and longing. "But it is not that simple." For the first time, the princess allowed herself to lean into the possibility of something more than what tradition demanded. And for James, that moment of vulnerability, shared between two very different worlds, was all he needed to know that whatever came next, it was worth pursuing. James rubbed his sore shoulders as he stepped out of the arena. The tension of the trial of honor still lingered in his muscles, but more than anything, he felt relief. He had passed. He had proven himself, and now he could finally focus on the real mission: diplomatic negotiations between Earth and the Zyverian Empire. As he walked down the palace corridors, two guards followed behind him, though their hostile expressions had softened. Instead of looking at him like a criminal, they now regarded him with cautious respect. Ahead, Princess Luraya waited. She was standing in a grand chamber, the walls glowing with Zyverian script, her royal robes flowing like liquid silver. James took a deep breath and stepped forward. "So, I passed." He smirked. "Does this mean I finally get to do my job?" Luraya studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You surprised many today, James Carter." James raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and what about you, Princess? Were you surprised?" A small flicker of amusement crossed her face, but it vanished quickly. "You endured the trial well. That is not something many off-worlders could do." James leaned against one of the stone pillars. "You know, for a second there, I thought Zalor was going to cut me in half." Luraya's silver eyes softened slightly. Commander Xalar does not take such tests lightly. If you had shown fear, he would have ended the trial instantly. James exhaled. Good thing I didn't blink then. Luraya tilted her head. Humans are interesting. James chuckled. I get that a lot. A long pause stretched between them. It wasn't uncomfortable, just different. Then Luraya spoke again. The High Council has approved the trade negotiations. We will discuss terms in the morning. James grinned. That's a relief. So, do I get a decent place to stay now? Maybe one that doesn't involve a guard watching my every move. Luraya gave him a knowing look. I will see to it personally. James blinked. Wait. Really? She nodded. You have earned respect, James Carter. My people will now see you as a guest, not an intruder. James straightened up. Well then, I'll try not to walk into any more private chambers. Luraya's lips twitched slightly, as if she was holding back a smile. That would be wise. James chuckled. Noted. As he followed the palace attendants to his new quarters, he glanced back at Luraya one last time. For the first time since arriving, he felt something shift between them. Respect. Understanding. Maybe even the beginning of something more. James was pushed forward through the grand hallways of the Xaverian palace, his arms still tightly gripped by the guards. His mind raced. He had never meant to offend anyone, but now he was being treated like a criminal. They finally arrived at the council chamber, a vast circular room filled with high-ranking Xaverian nobles. The walls were lined with glowing blue symbols, and at the center sat a half-circle of elders, their robes flowing like liquid silver. Their golden eyes studied James with a mixture of curiosity and disapproval. Princess Luraya was already there, standing tall and composed. Despite her calm face, James could tell she was frustrated, maybe even embarrassed. The High Chancellor, an old Xaverian with deep blue skin and sharp, intelligent eyes, tapped his staff against the floor. Human James Carter, you have committed an offense against the royal family. Do you understand the gravity of this situation? James took a deep breath. He had to be careful with his words. Honorable Chancellor, he began, I swear on my life that I meant no disrespect. It was a misunderstanding. I was told to wait in a chamber, but the door was open. I assumed it was part of my assigned room. I had no idea it led to the princess's private chambers. The council members whispered among themselves. Some nodded, while others shook their heads in disapproval. One elder scoffed. Ignorance is no excuse. Would we be forgiven if we walked into a human queen's chambers uninvited? James clenched his jaw. They had a point. If an alien walked into the president's personal quarters on Earth, it would be considered a serious offense. Princess Luraya finally spoke, her voice firm but composed. I believe the human did not intend to offend, she said. However, our laws demand that violations of royal privacy must be answered. We cannot simply let him go without consequences. James' stomach sank. This wasn't going to be easy. The Chancellor leaned forward. Then what punishment do you suggest, Princess? Luraya hesitated for a brief moment before responding. A trial of honor. The room fell silent. Even the guards shifted uncomfortably. James frowned. What? Luraya's silver eyes locked onto his. A test that will prove whether you are worthy of remaining in the palace. If you pass, the offense will be forgiven. If you fail, you will be exiled from Xaverian territory forever. James's heart pounded. He had no idea what the trial involved, but from the serious expressions of the nobles, it was clear this would not be easy. The Chancellor nodded. Then it is decided. The human will face the trial of honor at dawn. As the guards led him away, James took a deep breath. He had one night to prepare, or he would never step foot on this planet again. James stood in the center of the arena, his heart pounding as the morning sun cast long shadows across the stone floor. The arena wasn't large, but its circular design and high walls made it feel like a battlefield. The Xaverian High Council sat on a raised platform, watching in silence. Princess Lyraya stood among them, her silver eyes unreadable. Across from James stood his opponent, Commander Xalar, a towering Xyverian warrior with dark violet skin and golden war paint across his face. He held a ceremonial blade, curved and sharp, its silver edge reflecting the sunlight. James swallowed hard. "The trial of honor will now begin," the Chancellor announced. Xalar stepped forward, gripping the blade. His golden eyes locked onto James. "Do not move. Do not react. Show weakness, and you fail." His voice was like stone grinding against metal. James nodded, forcing himself to stay calm. He had no armor, no weapons, only his own willpower. With incredible speed, Xalar lunged forward, slashing the air just inches from James's face. James barely resisted the urge to flinch. The blade whistled through the air, slicing close to his throat before pulling back. Then again, this time so close he could feel the cold metal against his skin. His instincts screamed at him to move, to dodge, to defend himself. But he knew, one wrong move, and he would fail. Xalar circled him like a predator, testing him, watching for even the slightest reaction. Another slash, this time near his legs. Another, just beside his ear. James clenched his jaw, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. The entire arena was silent, all eyes locked on him. Then, Xalar did something unexpected. He lifted the blade and pressed it lightly against James's chest. James's breath hitched, but he didn't step back. A long pause. Then, Xalar smirked. He passes. The arena erupted with whispers and murmurs. The Chancellor stood. The human has proven his honor. The charges against him are dropped. James exhaled sharply, relief flooding through him. Xalar stepped back, giving him an approving nod. "You have the heart of a warrior, human. Perhaps you are not so weak after all." James smirked. "Thanks, I guess." As he turned toward the council, his eyes met Lyraya's. For the first time, he saw something new in her gaze: respect. She gave him a small nod before speaking. "The negotiations will continue as planned. You have earned your place here, James Carter." James grinned. "Well, that's a relief. Now, can we talk about trade deals? Or do I have to dodge more swords first?" Lyraya's lips curved slightly. "That depends on how well you behave." James chuckled. Maybe this mission wasn't doomed after all. The next few days passed quickly for James. After the trial of honor, he found himself treated with a new level of respect by the Xyverians. He was given a comfortable room near the royal quarters and was allowed to meet with various officials to discuss the trade negotiations. The atmosphere in the palace had shifted. He was no longer viewed as an outsider, but as someone who had proven himself worthy of their trust. Still, there was a lingering feeling of tension whenever he crossed paths with Princess Lyraya. Their interactions had been professional, but the unspoken attraction between them was undeniable. James couldn't help but notice the way Lyraya's silver eyes seemed to soften whenever they made eye contact. Her usual cold demeanor had melted, if only slightly, ever since he passed the trial. She had begun to spend more time with him, discussing the terms of the trade agreement and even sharing some of the Xyverian history with him. One evening, after another long meeting in the council chambers, James found himself walking through the palace gardens, trying to clear his head. The garden was beautiful, glowing flowers with petals that shifted colors, strange trees with fruits that hummed when touched, and a faint mist that seemed to float just above the ground. It was the perfect place for quiet reflection, or so he thought. To his surprise, he wasn't alone. Princess Lyraya was standing by the edge of the garden, looking out over the distant city below. The soft glow of the garden lights illuminated her features, giving her an almost ethereal quality. James approached her cautiously, unsure if she was here to discuss something official or if it was just a moment of peace for herself. "Princess Lyraya," he said softly, not wanting to disturb her if she preferred solitude. She turned, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his heart skip a beat. "James Carter, I did not expect to find you here." James smiled, though it was a little awkward. "I needed a break from the meetings. Thought I'd get some fresh air." Loraya nodded and stepped aside, motioning for him to join her. "It is peaceful here, isn't it?" He nodded, taking a step closer. The garden was peaceful, but there was a strange tension hanging in the air between them. "I've never seen anything like this. Your gardens, they're beautiful." Loraya smiled, her eyes lighting up slightly. "Our people believe that beauty should be found in the smallest things. It is not just about grand structures or impressive technology, but about appreciating what nature has to offer." James felt a warmth spread through him at the way she spoke, gentle, thoughtful. It wasn't the cold, distant royal he had first met. There was something more here, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. As he looked at her, he noticed the way her lips curved slightly, the way her eyes softened when she looked at him. For a moment, it almost felt like they were no longer diplomat and princess, but two people who simply understood each other. Before he could speak, she broke the silence. "James, Her voice trailed off for a moment, as if she was searching for the right words. "I am grateful for your patience. You have not only proven your honor but your strength in adapting to our ways. Most would have failed." He smiled, stepping closer. "I'm just doing my job." Loraya looked down, her face slightly flushed. "Perhaps, but sometimes there is more to it than just doing your job." The air between them shifted, the words hanging unspoken. Neither of them said anything more, but the connection between them was undeniable. For the first time, James realized how much he had come to admire this strong, proud alien princess, and maybe, just maybe, there was something more growing between them. As they stood together in the garden, the palace around them seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, caught in the quiet stillness of the moment. 1 second, he was standing in awe, his brain struggling to process the fact that he had accidentally walked in on an alien princess unclothed. The next second, loud alarms echoed through the palace halls, and heavy footsteps thundered toward the chamber. "Wait, it's a mistake," James shouted, raising his hands in surrender. But it was too late. The guards stormed in, 4 towering Xaverian warriors, their golden eyes burning with fury. They were armed with plasma-tipped spears, and their armor gleamed under the soft golden lights of the chamber. Princess Loraya had already grabbed a silken robe, wrapping it around herself with a grace that only royalty could manage. But her face was still filled with shock, confusion, and something James couldn't quite read. Embarrassment. Anger. Both. "Seize him," she ordered. James barely had time to blink before 2 of the guards grabbed his arms, their grip as strong as steel. He struggled for a moment, but it was useless. The Xaverians were much stronger than humans. It was a mistake," James tried to explain, his heart pounding. "No one told me this was your private chamber. I was just looking for—" Silence. One of the guards growled, shoving him forward. Loraya took a deep breath, trying to regain her composure. She walked forward, her piercing silver eyes locked onto him. "Do you have any idea what you have done, human?" she said, her voice calm but deadly. "You entered the private chambers of the Xaverian royal family. Do you understand how serious this offense is?" James swallowed hard. He had heard about Xaverian laws before coming here. Their culture was vastly different from Earth's. While they didn't share the same human ideas of modesty, personal space and privacy were sacred to them. Entering a royal's private area without permission was considered a crime, a severe one. This was bad. Really bad. "I swear, Princess Loraya, I didn't mean to. The attendant told me to wait in my chamber, but the door was open, I thought." Loraya's sharp gaze studied him. Her expression softened, just slightly, but her voice remained firm. "Ignorance of our laws does not excuse your actions." She turned to her guards. "Take him to the High Council. They will decide his fate." James felt a cold chill run through him. The High Council. That sounded very official and very dangerous. The guards dragged him out of the chamber, down the long crystal hallways of the palace. Other Xaverians stopped and stared, whispering in their melodic language. Some looked curious, others looked disgusted. James clenched his jaw. He was supposed to be negotiating a trade agreement, not facing a trial for trespassing in a princess's bathing chamber. How had everything gone so wrong so fast?